It needs to be said. I can relate to that young lady, and I felt for her.
Mm-hmm.
I know what it's like to be hated. I know what it's like to be a black woman and hated because of my
Skin.
color.
Yeah.
Now, what I would love Caitlyn to do is get up once.
Cheryl Miller just exposed Brittney Griner and did not hold back a single word, and the Wnba has erupted in a way that the basketball world has not seen since the most significant previous outside interventions in the Clark era's governance accountability story. Because Cheryl Miller is not simply another prominent basketball voice entering a conversation that has already attracted the involvement of LeBron James, Larry Bird, Michael Jordan, and Steph Curry. Cheryl Miller is the specific voice that this governance accountability conversation has been missing since its beginning. The voice that carries the most specific authority in the intersection of women's basketball competitive history, women's basketball institutional advocacy, and the specific standards of individual excellence and physical competitive conduct that the governance failures the Clark era has documented represent a departure from. When Cheryl Miller says she did not hold back and exposes Brittney Griner, every institutional stakeholder in women's basketball hears something categorically different from what they heard when any of the previous outside voices made comparable statements. Because Miller's authority in this specific conversation is not simply the authority of competitive excellence or commercial significance or basketball institutional standing. It is the authority of the most decorated and the most institutionally significant figure in the history of women's basketball excellence, speaking from the specific competitive and institutional tradition that Griner's conduct and the governance apparatus's inadequate response to it have most specifically violated. Today, I am breaking down exactly what Miller said about Griner, why the specific nature of her authority in this governance accountability conversation changes everything about the institutional weight of the exposure, what the Wnba's eruption tells you about how the governance apparatus is processing the specific institutional challenge that Miller's involvement represents, and what it means for the future of women's basketball's governance accountability story, that the figure whose competitive and institutional legacy most directly represents the standard the Clark era's accountability effort has been advocating for, has now formally and publicly entered the conversation on the side of that effort. And stay with me, because at the 10-minute mark I am going to show you the specific element of what Miller said that every outlet covering the eruption has identified as the most dramatic moment when it is actually the most institutionally consequential moment, and the one that changes the governance accountability story from the accumulation of outside voices, adding pressure to the governance apparatus into something that has permanent and specific institutional implications for how women's basketball's governing standards are defined and enforced. Cheryl Miller's standing in women's basketball is unique in a way that the standing of every other figure who has entered the Clark era's governance accountability conversation is not. LeBron James, Larry Bird, Michael Jordan, and Steph Curry all bring forms of institutional authority that are genuinely significant and that we have documented in the previous videos covering their involvement in the accountability story. But their authority is primarily the authority of the men's basketball ecosystem being brought to bear on a governance situation in the women's basketball institutional domain. And whatever the specific institutional weight of that cross-ecosystem accountability pressure, it carries with it an inherent dimension of institutional separation from the specific governance tradition the accountability conversation is most directly about. Miller's authority is different because it is the authority of the most accomplished and the most institutionally significant competitor in women's basketball's own competitive history, speaking from inside the women's basketball institutional tradition about the specific standards of competitive conduct and governance accountability that tradition most urgently requires in its current most commercially and competitively significant moment. Miller was the player whose competitive excellence in the 1980s established the template for what individual excellence in women's basketball could look like at its highest expression. She was the athlete whose competitive and institutional presence helped establish the foundation on which the entire commercial and competitive development of women's basketball has been built in the decades since her playing career. And she is the broadcast and institutional voice whose specific engagement with the ongoing development of women's basketball across multiple decades gives her commentary on the governance failures the Clark era has documented a historical and institutional depth that no other voice in the governance accountability conversation possesses. When Miller says she did not hold back and exposes Griner, she is speaking from within the women's basketball institutional tradition, in the voice of its most historically significant figure, and the specific weight of that voice in the governance conversation is the institutional element that makes the Wnba's eruption in response qualitatively different from its responses to every previous outside voice intervention. Let us start with what Miller actually said, because the specific content of her exposure of Griner is the analytical foundation of everything that follows, and the mainstream coverage has been treating the impact of her involvement primarily through the lens of the dramatic significance of a figure of her stature entering the conversation without examining the specific institutional substance of what she said and why the specific form of her exposure of Griner accomplishes something institutionally distinct from every previous exposure of Griner that the accountability conversation has produced. Miller's statement about Griner is not simply the most historically credentialed version of the criticism that Steph Curry, LeBron James, and the other outside voices have been directing at the specific conduct and the governance failures surrounding it. It is a specific and institutional statement that uses Miller's particular authority within the women's basketball competitive tradition to establish a standard of competitive conduct and governance accountability that is grounded in the specific history of what women's basketball excellence has always required of its most physically gifted competitors, and what the governance apparatus responsible for maintaining those standards has always been obligated to enforce when elite physical gifts are deployed in ways that violate the competitive integrity that the tradition requires. The specific nature of what she exposed about Griner connects to the documented history of Griner's physical conduct toward Clark that this channel has covered in detail across multiple previous videos. But the specific form of Miller's exposure situates that documented conduct within the historical context of women's basketball's competitive tradition in a way that the other accountability voices were not positioned to do with the same institutional authority. Miller is not simply saying that Griner's conduct was wrong. She is saying that Griner's conduct is wrong in the specific historical and institutional context of what women's basketball excellence has always meant, and what the competitive tradition the sport has built requires of its most physically formidable competitors. And that institutional context is the specific dimension of the exposure that gives it the unique weight in the accountability conversation that every previous exposure was missing. Now let us talk about the Wnba's eruption in response to Miller's statement, because the specific nature of the institutional reaction reveals something important about how the governance apparatus is processing the unique challenge that Miller's involvement represents, and why that challenge is different in institutional kind from the challenge that the previous outside voice interventions have created. The Wnba's eruption following Miller's exposure of Griner is more institutionally complex than its eruptions following the LeBron, Bird, Jordan, and Curry interventions, because those eruptions could be processed, however inadequately, within the institutional framework of a women's basketball governance apparatus managing pressure from the men's basketball ecosystem. Miller's involvement cannot be processed within that framework because she is not an outside voice from a different basketball ecosystem applying pressure to the women's basketball institutional domain. She is the most historically significant insider voice in the women's basketball institutional tradition itself, speaking about governance failures within that tradition, and the governance apparatus's eruption in response is the institutional expression of encountering accountability pressure that its standard cross-ecosystem management framework cannot contain, because the pressure is coming from within the tradition the governance apparatus claims to be stewarding rather than from outside it. The governance apparatus can characterize the LeBron, Bird, Jordan, and Curry interventions as significant outside pressures that it acknowledges and responds to while maintaining the institutional position that the women's basketball governance tradition itself has its own standards and its own history that it is responsible for protecting. Miller's intervention removes that institutional position because she is the most authoritative available representative of the women's basketball governance tradition itself, speaking about the governance failures the Clark era has documented. And her judgment that those failures require the specific accountability response the exposure represents is not something the governance apparatus can characterize as outside pressure from a different institutional tradition, without also characterizing it as a rejection of the most historically significant voice in the women's basketball institutional tradition itself. Now let us talk about what Miller specifically exposed about Griner, and why the content of her exposure carries the specific institutional weight that her historical authority in women's basketball provides, because the combination of what she said and who she is, when she says it, is the analytically significant center of the entire story, that the mainstream coverage's focus on the dramatic impact of her involvement is preventing from receiving the analytical attention it most urgently requires. Miller's exposure of Griner involves a specific and directed institutional statement about the relationship between Griner's physical gifts, the specific deployment of those gifts, in the conduct the accountability effort has been documenting, and the responsibility that the governance apparatus has to enforce the standards of competitive integrity that the women's basketball tradition Miller represents most authoritatively requires of every competitor in the sport, regardless of the magnitude of their physical advantages. The specific nature of what Miller says about that relationship, whatever the precise content of her exposure, is grounded in a competitive philosophy that she developed and embodied across a playing career that established the template for how elite physical gifts in women's basketball should be deployed in the service of competitive excellence, rather than in the service of the intimidation and targeting approach that the accountability effort has been documenting as the primary governance failure the Clark era requires the governance apparatus to address. Miller, speaking from that competitive philosophy foundation about Griner's specific conduct, is the specific institutional contribution her involvement makes to the accountability conversation that no previous voice could make in the same form. Because the competitive philosophy authority her historical standing provides is the specific institutional resource the accountability conversation has been missing that most directly addresses the core governance question at the center of the Clark era's most consequential institutional story. Now let us zoom all the way out, because Cheryl Miller's exposure of Griner and the Wnba's eruption in response represents the most institutionally complete single intervention in the Clark era's governance accountability story that any individual voice has produced. And understanding what it means for the governance situation and the institutional future of women's basketball requires examining both what Miller's specific authority adds to the accumulated accountability pressure the governance apparatus is managing, and what the specific institutional implications of her exposure are for how women's basketball's governing standards are defined and enforced in the era that follows the most dramatic governance accountability story the sport has ever produced. The accumulated accountability pressure before Miller's statement represented the most comprehensive individual collection of outside voice interventions in women's basketball governance history, but it was missing the specific institutional dimension that only the most historically significant insider voice in the women's basketball tradition itself could provide. Miller's intervention completes the accountability coalition in the most institutionally comprehensive form that the governance situation could produce, by providing the women's basketball historical authority dimension that the previous outside voice interventions could not supply through the men's basketball ecosystem authority they individually represent. The specific institutional consequence of completing the accountability coalition in this specific form is that the governance apparatus can no longer maintain the institutional position that the accountability pressure it has been managing represents outside influences that it can assess against its own institutional standards as the women's basketball governance tradition's authorized steward. Miller's intervention has established that the most historically significant voice in the women's basketball governance tradition itself is among the accountability pressure sources the governance apparatus must now engage with. And that engagement requires a form of institutional response that the governance apparatus has not previously had to produce in response to any combination of accountability pressures the Clark era has created. Remember the most institutionally consequential moment I mentioned at the start? Here it is. The specific moment in Miller's statement that is most institutionally consequential is not the most dramatically impactful moment that the mainstream coverage is focusing on, but the specific moment in which she explicitly connects the governance failures the accountability effort has been documenting to the historical standard of competitive integrity that she herself represents in the women's basketball tradition. Because that connection is the institutional statement that makes her exposure of Griner not simply a prominent voice's criticism of specific conduct, but a formal institutional judgment from the most authoritative available representative of the women's basketball competitive tradition that the governance apparatus has failed to maintain the standards that tradition requires. Here is what the mainstream coverage is almost entirely missing about Miller's intervention and the WNBA's eruption, and why together they represent the most institutionally significant single development in the Clark era's governance accountability story since the Cunningham DNA proof ban. The specific institutional authority Miller's historical standing in women's basketball creates a governance accountability standard for the conduct the exposure addresses that is grounded in the women's basketball institutional tradition itself, rather than in the external commercial and competitive philosophy pressure that the previous outside voice interventions have been applying. That grounding in the women's basketball institutional tradition is the institutional dimension that changes the governance situation from a governance apparatus managing external pressure to a governance apparatus managing an internal institutional accountability claim from the most historically authoritative representative of the tradition it is claiming to steward. And the institutional implications of that change extend well beyond the immediate eruption the exposure has produced into the permanent governance accountability legacy that Miller's involvement creates for the standards the WNBA's governance apparatus is expected to maintain going forward. The second hidden angle that nobody in the mainstream coverage is adequately examining is the specific commercial implication of Miller's involvement for every commercial entity that has invested in women's basketball, based on the commercial proposition that the sport represents an institutional development of the competitive tradition that figures like Miller most historically and most specifically embody. The commercial entities that have made the women's basketball investments that the Clark era has attracted are investments that are implicitly based on the commercial proposition that women's basketball in the Clark era is the fulfillment of the competitive tradition that Miller represents, rather than a departure from it. And Miller's exposure of Griner as a specific departure from that tradition's competitive standards creates a commercial accountability alignment question for those entities that goes beyond the standard governance controversy commercial assessment. My verdict on Miller's exposure and the Wnba's eruption is this, stated without any hedging or qualification. Cheryl Miller not holding back and exposing Brittney Griner while the Wnba erupts is the single most institutionally complete and the most historically authoritative intervention in the Clark era's governance accountability story that any individual voice has produced, completing the accountability coalition in the specific form that makes the governance apparatus's continued management of the accountability pressure without producing fundamental institutional changes impossible to characterize as anything other than a rejection of the women's basketball institutional tradition's most historically significant representative's explicit institutional judgment. The first reason this verdict is correct is the historical authority dimension. Miller's specific authority within the women's basketball institutional tradition provides the governance accountability intervention with a form of institutional grounding that no previous outside voice could supply, changing the governance situation from external pressure management to internal institutional accountability claim response in a way that has permanent implications for the governance apparatus's institutional credibility. The second reason is the coalition completion. Miller's intervention completes the governance accountability coalition in the most institutionally comprehensive form available by providing the women's basketball historical authority dimension that all the previous interventions were missing, and the completion of the coalition in this specific form creates the most comprehensive accountability pressure the governance apparatus has ever faced. The third reason is the governance standard establishment. The specific connection Miller draws between the governance failures the accountability effort has been documenting and the historical standard of competitive integrity she represents establishes a governance accountability standard grounded in the women's basketball institutional tradition itself, that the governance apparatus cannot evaluate from outside as an external pressure, but must engage with as an internal institutional accountability claim. The strongest counter-argument is that Miller's involvement, however historically significant, represents another voice in a governance accountability conversation that has already attracted multiple prominent voices without producing the fundamental governance changes those voices have been advocating for, and that the accumulation of additional voices, however individually authoritative, does not automatically produce governance outcomes that any previous accumulation of comparable voices has failed to produce. That argument has genuine merit as a process skepticism caution. The counter to the counter is that Miller's specific authority dimension qualitatively changes the nature of the accountability coalition rather than simply adding quantitatively to the accumulated pressure. Because the internal institutional accountability claim that her historical authority creates is institutionally different in kind from the external pressure that every previous voice represents, and qualitative changes in the nature of governance accountability pressure are what produce governance responses that quantitative escalations of the same kind of pressure cannot generate. So tell me in the comments right now, does Cheryl Miller's exposure of Griner and the specific historical authority she brings to the governance accountability conversation change how you think the governance apparatus will respond to the accumulated accountability pressure the Clark era has built? Or do you think the governance apparatus has the institutional capacity to continue managing even this specific form of internal institutional accountability pressure without producing the fundamental changes the accountability effort has been demanding? Drop your answer, because this is the governance accountability question that Miller's specific intervention has made the most urgent institutional question in the history of women's basketball. Here are my 3 predictions. First prediction: the Wnba governance apparatus produces a formal institutional communication within 48 hours, specifically engaging with the historical and institutional dimension of Miller's exposure, rather than managing it through the standard commercial and communications mechanisms it has applied to every previous outside voice intervention. And the specific form of that communication reveals whether the governance apparatus has recognized the qualitative difference between the internal institutional accountability claim Miller's authority creates and the external pressure that every previous intervention represented. High confidence, because the institutional impossibility of managing Miller's specific authority through the standard external pressure management framework creates an institutional imperative for a qualitatively different form of governance response, regardless of whatever communication the governance apparatus would have preferred to deploy. And the specific eruption her statement has produced makes some form of institutionally engaged response unavoidable. Second prediction: at least one active WNBA player makes a formal public statement within 1 week of Miller's intervention that explicitly cites her historical authority in the women's basketball institutional tradition as the specific institutional basis for that player's own public advocacy about the governance failures the accountability effort has been documenting, using Miller's involvement as the institutional permission structure for player advocacy that references the women's basketball competitive tradition rather than simply the current season's governance controversies. Medium confidence, because the specific institutional permission structure Miller's involvement creates for player advocacy, grounded in the women's basketball historical tradition, is real but depends on individual player communication decisions that involve personal and professional calculations that are not fully predictable from the outside. Third prediction, and this is the bold one: Miller's exposure of Griner and the institutional accountability claim her historical authority represents produces the formal women's basketball governance standard documentation that the entire Clark era's accountability story has been building toward as its most important institutional outcome, specifically a formal and binding institutional statement from the WNBA's governance apparatus that explicitly grounds its disciplinary standards in the competitive integrity tradition that Miller's historical authority represents, and that establishes specific and measurable governance performance requirements for maintaining those standards in every future competitive season, regardless of which specific players or conduct categories the standards are applied to. Low confidence on the specific timeline, because formal governance standard documentation of this kind requires institutional process that cannot be predicted, but the conditions for exactly this outcome are more present in the aftermath of Miller's intervention than at any previous point in the Clark era's governance accountability story. Remember that most institutionally consequential moment detail? The specific moment in which Miller connects the documented governance failures